What do you think the most appropriate religious emotion is? Yes, it's an open-ended question, yeah. What's the most appropriate religious emotion? Love? Peace? Wonder? Service? Gratitude? Compassion? Okay, these are all great. And my guess is that a lot of us have felt things that weren't love, service, compassion, peace, gratitude when dealing with religion. One of the most prominent emotional experiences I had as a person of faith in my young life was probably fear or anxiety. I can remember shortly after my baptism, I left the traditional church, and even though I've told you that I went from being a fundamentalist Christian to a fundamentalist atheist pretty quick, and I left, and I remember in middle school calling a friend of mine and with tears in my eyes telling her that I thought the God I didn't believe in was going to send me to hell. If those two things could exist at the same time, I was terrified of not knowing if who I was or thought or believed was going to end up with me being punished for all eternity. My guess is somebody else in the room has felt that way sometime. In the United States, in the early colonial period and in the 1800s, there was this anxiety and fervor around fear and religion of knowing where we were going. Who were the saved and who were the damned, and the Great Awakening and Jonathan Edwards, the sinners in the hands of an angry God. Or in the Puritan period with the focus on predestination, people were said to be so anxious about knowing whether or not they were the saved or the damned that they would try to commit the worst sin they could to prove either way. If I'm in the saved, God won't let me do this, but at least I'll know. And the knowledge of salvation or damnation would relax. There's stories of horrendous things happening because of people's anxiety. And it was into these contexts in American history of anxiety about heaven and hell and who belonged and who didn't that our tradition really stepped onto the scene. Unitarian Universalism didn't exist packaged like that in the beginning. It was two separate religions, and we're spending these 2 weeks looking at those. The basic, we're flying 30,000 feet over the religion view would say that we are the result of a marriage of two progressive Christian Protestant denominations. One, the Unitarians, who believed that not only were we not born depraved, we were born good and holy. The presence of God in us was our capacity to reason. They believed that Jesus was a human, that humans were good, and that God was not three but one. There were people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. A gross caricature that's about 80% accurate but helpful would be to say that they were the wealthy Boston Brahmin elite of New England, Harvard-educated merchant class, God's frozen chosen. On the other side would be our Universalist heritage. This is the country cousins of the Unitarians, not in the urban centers as much as out in the country. The religion was spread by circuit-riding preachers and tent revivals where they would say things like, God loves you and there's nothing you can do about it, go home. They preached an everlasting love of God that knew no bounds. They started with the notion that maybe there was a hell that you went to for a little until you were sorry, to there's a hell but nobody goes there. And then they finally came to what's called the ultra-universalist position. There was no hell, there is no hell, there will never be a hell. Their church bells were said to ring out, no hell, no hell, no hell. And you couldn't serve on a jury in the United States for a little bit if you were a Universalist. We couldn't be trusted with our moral judgments. So here we have the urban-centered, highly educated merchant class, the heady progressives, and the country cousins with the big hearts. It would be as if Ruth Bader Ginsburg married Willie Nelson. Okay, you've got your tireless activist for progress and hope in human reason and the future, who is wonderful but probably not palatable to everybody in the country, and then your loving country cousin who can hang with anybody. And those two groups got married in 1961 and became the Unitarian Universalist Association. And so today we say that we take that history seriously but not literally. That we believe that everyone experiences God in many ways, and that's good. That everyone without exception is worthy of love and justice. And that religion is not about what happens when you die, but rather how you build a just and loving life right here and right now. Today our focus is on the Universalists. One of my favorite was a guy named Hosea Ballou, and they all had names like this. Hosea Ballou spread Universalism more than most in the 1800s, and he left traditional religion after his baptism. He was born right before the Revolution. His dad was a Baptist preacher, and a holy roller preacher came to town for a revival. He went to the service and felt the Spirit and went down to the altar to get saved. I don't know if they were singing Just As I Am then or not, but they went down and he got saved. And he immediately thought something was wrong with him. The thing that was wrong with him was that he was not afraid of God. He said, "Here I am and I feel saved, but I'm not scared. Something must be wrong with me." And so he left and started reading Universalist literature, which said that God loved you and would not leave you and would not leave you alone. And he started preaching and had these kind of very Universalist, easy to understand, folksy ways of getting to the argument. He said, if you had a child and they fell in the mud and got dirty, would you wash them because you love them, or would you only love them after they were clean? And he said, that's how God works. The holy loves and embraces you not after you become a different person. In his early 20s, he wrote this book called A Treatise on Atonement. And his central argument goes like this: it makes no sense for an infinite God to infinitely punish finite people for making finite mistakes. Said in a legal manner, the punishment will never fit the crime. We just can't do something so bad that God would punish us forever. His movement from fear to belonging turned the entire point of religion on its head. In his book, he said, in the relationship between God and human beings, God is not the dissatisfied party. In the relationship between God and human beings, God is not the dissatisfied party. In his 19th century mindset, God didn't have a problem with us. We have a problem with life and God. And so, almost immediately for these folks, religion didn't become about getting people into heaven, because that's where everybody was going anyway. Religion became about getting heaven into people and getting heaven onto the earth. They preached about loving your enemies right now because you're about to spend eternity with them. They preached radical equality of the races and sexes and genders and classes. A man named George de Benneville, and I've used his story a couple of times here, but we Unitarian Universalists don't have a lot of good miracle stories, and so I'm going to use his again. This guy, George de Benneville, who was born in 1705, was a French Protestant, a Huguenot. His family was persecuted. His mom and his dad both died, and he was put under the protection of the Queen of England. He was a hard-to-get-along-with kind of person. And so at the age of 12, because he was just so much fun, the people in his life said, you need to be on a boat very far away from all of us. And they put him at 12 years old on a boat to go sail the seas as a merchant. While he was there, as this young white French Protestant in the 1700s, He had a relationship with black Muslims that changed his religious life forever. He watched this group of black Muslims crying over a friend who had torn his leg open, and they said that they were pouring their tears into their friend's wound to heal it and praying that he would be loved and healed by the God who loves all. In his journal, he went back and wrote, "I've been taught my whole life that white people were superior to people with darker skin, and it's not true. They are the holy ones. These non-Christians are the real devout, and I am the heathen." He went into a deep depression because he thought that he was going to hell, and in a vision was told that everything would be fine and that everybody's going to heaven. So he goes to France and Germany and begins preaching Universalism secretly in the woods at night. It's illegal at the time. They find him out, and he's tried and sentenced to death 3 times. On one occasion, his head is literally on the chopping block when a person runs up with a note that says the King of England has secured his release. So, he's getting ready to start a new preaching season when he catches a fever. He goes into a deep fever dream so strong that he's pronounced dead for 2 days. His brother builds him a coffin, puts him in, and waits for the funeral. While he is in that state, he has this vision. In the vision, God takes him from the depths of hell all the way up to heaven in a Dante Alighieri-style journey, showing him people who suffer, and he meets Adam and Eve and Jesus and God, and at the end of it, God in the vision looks at him and says, "These are all symbols. You get that, right? None of this is literally true, and I am a divine source of wisdom and compassion that knows no religious bounds, nor genders or races. Go forth and preach a love that knows no bodily bounds." And so he wakes up, literally steps out of a coffin, gains quite a following, and goes forth to preach Universalism. He, like some others, moved to what's now the United States right before the Revolution. He buys a farm in Pennsylvania where they host these revivals, where he trades with native peoples and has women preach, has people of all faiths preach in this river next to his house. The Battle of Germantown happens on his land, on the far corner of it. And he's a sympathizer and gives money to the revolutionaries, but 2 British soldiers are killed in the battle. One of the officers comes forward and says, "We don't have a place to bury our dead, and we're worried that their bodies will be desecrated if we put them somewhere else." And George de Benneville says, "Well, I'm a Universalist. You can bury them with me and my family." So if you go to his family burial plot today, you'll find George de Benneville and his wife and these 2 enemy soldiers. He wrote a book about it, a book titled, this is how they wrote, "The Life and Trance of the Dr. George de Benneville, an account of what he saw and heard during a trance of 42 hours, both in the regions of happiness and misery, together with a very short account of his cruel persecution in France for preaching the gospel." It's a catchy title, right? But in it he says that true society will not be formed until we understand that all religions are mere symbols pointing to a reality far beyond what we experience. That all genders, all sexes, all races, all religions must live in absolute full equality if this thing called democracy is ever going to exist. For him, the move from fear and judgment to belonging and courage had social consequences. The Universalist ordained the first woman to be ordained by a denominational body in the United States at all. Her name was Olympia Brown. She was this absolutely tough suffragist Universalist preacher who would ride in the back of wagons through Kansas preaching Universalism and women's suffrage while people spat on her and cursed and hit her with sticks and rocks and threw rotten food at her. She was one of the only original suffragists to live long enough to vote and was arrested chaining herself to the White House in her 80s. Don't you love it? In the 20th century, this religion of a basically Christian-loving God became more than that. It gave up having to live only in the Christian story. And in fact, their symbol for a while was a circle with an off-centered cross in it, which meant, we're Christian, but you don't have to be. God is bigger than all of this. In the mid-20th century, a guy named Ken Patton in Boston had this church where they would paint the Milky Way galaxy on the ceiling. And there were pictures of atoms all over the place, and he tore the pews out and everyone met in the middle. It became a cosmic religion that instead of a loving God was more focused on the fact that you are home. You are home in this planet, in this universe, in your body. That the divine forces that created and sustain and nurture your life will never, ever, ever let you go. For some today, that looks like a loving God. And for some, it looks like knowing that, as the reading said, the infinite will never let go of us like gravity. Some people make mistakes, like the children's story, approximations of what universalism means today that just aren't entirely right. Some people claim that our church cannot make strong statements of conscience or stand up for justice and clearly state the oppressions that we will fight because we're universalists and we love everybody. Not only can you stand up for justice when you affirm that all people are worthy of love, you must stand up for justice when you affirm that all people are worthy of love. We may not be trying to get people into heaven, but we are trying to get heaven onto the earth. And when our brothers and sisters or siblings of all kinds are put through hell, universalists stand up. And we do fight back. Not by dehumanizing the other side. Not by believing that we are now part of the righteous, because we are not. But because we know that we will not tolerate hell on earth. That's what universalism looks like now. It's an inward movement from fear and judgment to courage and belonging. It says that we work for justice with kindness. With kindness. If you've been a part of this congregation for a little bit and you're not kinder than you used to be, it's not working. If you're right but mean, we have work to do. Universalism would state that the heart is the center. We don't do our justice work in the world because we're right, but because we have known in our bones that we and everybody else belong. It's an inward movement from fear to courage and belonging, and an outward movement from isolation to justice and interdependence. It states clearly and without apology that we are all in this together. We're all in this room together. In every classroom, in every city, in every nation and planet and cosmos, it is impossible for one of us to be blessed while another is damned. Our fates are tied together, and as long as one of us suffers, every single one of us does too. It doesn't tolerate a world or a mindset or an ideology which would dehumanize another or take pleasure in their pain or isolation or oppression. My colleagues in ministry have gotten to using a phrase a lot lately that says, our calling as a religion is to love the hell out of the world. I think that's right on. But not just that, but to replace it with heaven. Not in some other world, not in some other room, not in some other marriage or church or city, but to ensure that the place where we are, the place where you are, looks more like heaven now than it did when you entered it. It is not easy. It's one of the most challenging approaches to being a person of faith you could possibly ever take. But it's worth it. And a worthwhile path for us all. May it be so. And amen.